Hello and welcome to the special edition of Footcast Social. This week we have a special guest who is going to probe all the important questions in the world of football, starting from the World Cup to the betting sponsors in the world of football. Joining me from London, it's Rob Harris. Welcome to the show, Rob. Rob, how is the situation in London?
Well, there can both be a bit of normality and complete disruption and that uncertainty, particularly for fans who can wake up on the day of a game not knowing if their match will be on. And that's not just the Premier League, but down in the EFL as well, all the lower leagues, and sometimes these decisions taken at late notice. So, it's a real picture of uncertainty. Also, while waiting to know if any fans will be allowed in at all, constantly on tenterhooks to see if there'll be a decision like in Scotland and Wales, or indeed the Netherlands and Germany, where the fans are shut out again. But for now, the fans get to go to stadiums in complete capacity numbers. But you notice, like Tottenham on their Boxing Day against Crystal Palace, that the attendance was only 40,000, so 20,000 empty seats. So that might well be people choosing to stay away, assessing their own risk as well, as we all wonder and watch and wait just how bad Omicron is as a variant.
There's been a talk about holding the World Cup every 2 years. Some players agree, most don't. What are your views on it?
One of the issues with this is the process that has been derived, constructed at FIFA to come about to this design of a World Cup every 2 years. So, first of all, separate whatever you think about it. Should there be a World Cup every 2 years? Part that argument. How should FIFA go about making such a fundamental change to the global game through open consultation and significant consultation, and not seeming like it's a conclusion before you've even started the process? But that's exactly what we've seen in the last couple of years. Gianni Infantino as FIFA president, building up to the moment throughout sort of the early parts of 2021, having started to talk about biennial World Cups in the women's game, which started sort of 2 years or so ago. And I think it's important to separate the men's and women's game in this discussion. I do think there are more merits to a World Cup every 2 years in the women's game due to the calendar being lighter and it being more focused on international football in terms of generating a lot of the growth, while also relying on the domestic leagues. But let's just look at that process. Gianni Infantino managed to secure at the FIFA Congress in May 2021 the backing for pushing ahead with a feasibility study to look at biennial World Cups. Yet he'd already spent significant time before then talking about why he wants a World Cup every 2 years. So what didn't take place was Gianni Infantino saying, we need a new international match calendar for men after 2024 and women after 2023. Let's look at what all the different options are. And the international match calendar is important because that's what sets out in a year when clubs have to release their players to go on international duty. And we're seeing some of that row take place now over the African Cup of Nations, with clubs managing to secure their players for an extra week before they go off to AFCON. But rather than FIFA saying we're going to have to reconfigure the international match calendar, we're going to launch consultation on everyone's views. Let's get an assessment over what all the challenges are, what are the issues with the calendar now. Maybe there are too many qualifiers, maybe there are too many international windows, maybe we want more tournaments. Get all those options back in, and then sort of go through the viability of each of the different structures and formats that the game could look like going forward. Instead, Infantino got this backing from the FIFA Congress, nominally after the Saudi FA put this proposal towards the FIFA Congress to put it on the table. And then he spent the sort of coming months trying to sort of build up support for this biennial World Cup, and largely using a lot of former players, the FIFA legends, who are sort of flown around the world and taken to sort of FIFA events and very removed, as it were, in some cases from the game today. And Arsene Wenger as well, on Infantino's behalf, him saying he backs the plan, going out and selling the vision. And he did so, however much we like it. Of course, we want everyone to come to the media to talk to us, but he did it largely through the media. So Arsene Wenger was setting out the plans in the media, it gave the impression of being, before talking to the FAs around the world, the clubs, and the various leagues. So it looked like sort of a PR campaign being done that way. And gradually, eventually, he did present the plans in September. And there are so many different questions over the status of these plans, and FIFA insisting it's not about the money, it's about the good of the game. Although in the last few weeks they have now made it about the money by touting some quite optimistic projections of things like the world's economies would benefit by £120 billion over a couple of decades if there was World Cups every 2 years. And if there was a biennial tournament, an extra $4 billion in FIFA's coffers, that would be over $10 billion they generate every 4 years, and that money could be distributed to the national FAs. But it's created a lot of bad feeling around the game, a sense of Gianni Infantino not fully consulting people, and also sort of saying it's what the youth wants, it's what the kids want, and producing some surveys where the findings have been produced and published in a certain way which can try to tilt the argument without necessarily full data sets, but certainly trying to suggest that kids won't watch football unless there's a World Cup every 2 years, which has certainly been a message from Gianni Infantino, and saying this is what is needed for the good of the game. And he often pits Europe against the rest of the world by almost saying it's a Eurocentric opposition to this. The rest of the world is being denied the opportunity to thrive and to get more opportunities at World Cups. Already the World Cup for men will expand to 48 teams from 2026. It's jumping from 24 to 32 teams for women. So already the World Cup is going to have more opportunities for teams to get involved. Yeah. And there is no, the way he discounts almost the opposition from Europe, denying his own rise, which is completely beholden to the fact he was at a senior position at UEFA for so many years, and claiming that this is needed to make football a truly global sport. Well, football has been the world's number one team sport for well over a century, and certainly even more so, it's the number one team sport in England at the moment, with cricket something to forget.
You've been known to ask tough questions. Do you regret asking those tough questions on funding, betting, and so on and so forth?
What it is about is asking questions and probing deeper and questioning. So whether that's on FIFA, questioning some of the motivations behind things and the strategy, and you often sense the reaction of organisations and sports leaders to your questions and how sometimes irritated they can be. Sometimes that, of course, could be perfectly justified at times, and you can assess actually if they are pushing back in a certain way that maybe you have called something wrong, but often it will betray their attempt to mask over some of the underlying issues. And this report, one by the journalist Jerry Durso, is pointing out issues around betting companies and questioning, actually, you see these betting sponsors appearing on Premier League jerseys or around the billboards at Premier League games, and many might not question. You just assume, well, because the club's done a deal, then they must be legitimate. But it's always important to sort of delve a bit further behind these things if you do have doubts, and we have seen it in recent weeks as well, with certain sponsorships being signed up. Manchester City signing up a crypto-related sponsorship, and when basic searches were done, the company didn't seem to have much of an internet history. The officials claimed to be with the company didn't seem to have much of a trail on the internet, which created doubts over how this sponsorship was ever done by Manchester City. Where was the due diligence? Was it a case of maybe in many organisations that no one wanted to question a person one step higher over how this was done or why they're being told to announce it?
Let me understand, your criticism is about the process of sponsorship and not just the sponsorship itself.
And very often it is the process that we question on. And a bit like with the Biennial World Cup, how are they reaching this decision? Are they going about it the right way, the most inclusive way in terms of really assessing the real views of the world? With these betting companies, it's a very delicate balancing act, because betting companies, legitimate ones, provide a lot of sponsorship that help to fund leagues like the EFL in England, the Sky Bet EFL in the US. Betting is on the rise as well. Horse racing in the UK, such a big sports which is so intertwined with the gambling industry and is such a day out for many people. So it's not the denial of betting, it's the relationship problem gambling and how advertising is framed. And there's been a lot more restrictions in the UK on how betting in sport is advertised, in terms of making sure they're messaging about not going too far, not spending more than you've got, and also restricting adverts in certain parts of television broadcasts too. But it perhaps showed the need to actually regulate in the industry, unlike the crypto industry, which is unregulated, and it's led to Arsenal being rebuked over its sponsorship deal with the Socios fan tokens. And Socios, another of those things you've seen them pop up, particularly in the last year or so across football, and you see multiple different clubs doing deals. So you think, well, actually, if Barcelona are doing this, if Manchester City are doing it, it must be fine. But then you start to question how they're monetizing the engagement of their fans, and it's all about are fans being exploited? And then you think, well, actually, a club sort of living in their own sort of bubble where they think they can actually just do anything, as we saw with things like the Super League and the attempt to launch that.
In your assessment, do you think there are far and few journalists who are asking those pithy questions?
We've never had more journalists, I think, probing the issues in sports, what we'd sort of classify as the sports news area rather than the pure sports. And whether it's the Russian doping scandal, which was exposed through journalism, the governing bodies, the IOC, the IAAF, did not want this to be exposed. It gave the impression of being, and it took rigorous reporting from the first coverage by the Mail on Sunday in the UK of the World Athletics Championships in Moscow in 2013 to keep up the pressure. It was journalists keeping up the pressure on FIFA as well, over their handling of some of the Russian cases as well, over sexual abuse cases, which FIFA have not been as taking forward as importantly at some times, with the vigor and the rigor needed for those investigations. And even things like the need for Afghanistan's female footballers to be airlifted out of Kabul in the summer. Well, that was something that, again, it took the media to start asking questions what FIFA was doing, and they started to only get involved, it seemed, after the players' union were at that time. But there are obviously many different areas of how sport is covered, and it's always important not to lose sight of the joy, the inspirational moments, the excitement, the buzz it creates from some of those significant moments, not to be too cynical. And some moments are purely uplifting and capturing the drama and the excitement that helps to connect the world. But it's not sacrificing that in terms of overlooking key questions when they need to be asked, because often those are the questions that the players, the athletes, do need asking on their behalf. Otherwise, they can feel they don't have the people actually looking out for them in terms of the governance of national FAs, of sports teams, and how often abuses and wrongdoing is covered up or goes unchecked, which actually can ultimately harm them. And quite frankly, often it's a balancing act in sport. I've seen at least one journalist say they don't ask for interviews from a particular football club because they don't want to be in their favour, knowing that they have to ask difficult questions and they have issues over their ownership.
Let's roll back the years, Rob. The year is 2011, the Champions League final, and you managed to anger the biggest club's manager, the most influential manager, Sir Alex Ferguson. Just take us through what happened on that day.
So there can be very much a difference between the perception and the reality of an incident and what is actually remembered over it all. And I state from the start that actually in the years after this incident, had good relations with Manchester United, interviews and things like that. And, the important thing for me was not to somehow revel in some public battle with Sir Alex Ferguson or indeed milk this incident. But let's take you back to 2011. It's May, it's the days before the Champions League final, and there'd been a brewing case involving Ryan Giggs. He'd sought an injunction in the courts to prevent reporting of an affair that he'd had, and it was a balancing act, because at one point it was what sort of a story was it? Was it just what would seen as a salacious story, a very damaging story, and indeed a very problematic story in terms of his family as well, knowing that there are actually people at the heart of it and there are emotions and lives. What tipped the balance in this story was earlier in that week ahead of the Champions League final was Ryan Giggs being named in Parliament as the person who took out this injunction, because it was a type of super injunction where the person actually asking for the banning order of the reporting could not be named to ensure there was no actual reporting of the case. Using parliamentary privilege, an MP went and named Ryan Giggs in Parliament as being the player who'd gone to court to prevent reporting of his affair. Now, that made it a very, very legitimate story. One of the biggest players in the country, one of Manchester United's most successful players of all time. And, this was something that we could have directly asked about, the fact he, having an affair with his brother's sister. But I thought, whatever we need at this Champions League final press conference and several days beforehand, we just need Alex Ferguson talking about Ryan Giggs. People want to hear Alex Ferguson on Ryan Giggs. So I thought I will not ask a question that starts off by saying and mentioning the injunction, the affair, but focus purely on Ryan Giggs, the footballer, which would give leeway for Alex Ferguson to say whatever he wanted to about the incident. He could choose then to say something about Giggs and backing him in any way. So actually I ask, Ryan Giggs, you're the most experienced Champions League player. This will be his third final for you. Just how important is he in the final? Words to those effect. So very open-ended, not mentioning the specific detail. And Alex Ferguson replies something like, well, all the players are important to me. Then I think nothing more of it. A follow-up question attempts to be interjected by a television reporter at that point, which I seem to remember was rebuffed. It was only later that I realised, after answering my question, Alex Ferguson had turned to the press officer to, suggest, well, to use the words, he'd get me and ban me for asking that. I was actually only made aware of this because a broadcaster had picked it up on the microphone, and that afternoon, when Syria and the civil war there was leading the headlines at one point, then once this video became available and once the broadcaster Sky found it, they made it into one of their top stories on the news, not even on the sports channel, which was slightly unusual. I was still at the Manchester United training ground as this was unfolding and sort of weighing up what to do, and being on the receiving end of many, many interview requests as well, of which I think I wisely, chose not to do them in conjunction with my company. It didn't need me to add anything to this. There were enough people defending me and my right to ask the question. And then by the next day, it was sort of front page and back page news in some papers, because it was obviously Alex Ferguson, renowned for his volatile temperament at times with reporters over the years, part of the key to his incredible success. It was a rarity in the fact it had been caught on camera in such a way, and it collided with Ryan Giggs already being a front page news story that week. So actually, Alex Ferguson only managed to add to the furore around the story, rather than probably just giving a pretty bland and response about Giggs. His conduct that day actually probably created a bigger distraction around the team, of course, and they lost the final to Barcelona at Wembley Stadium, which would turn out to be Alex Ferguson's last Champions League final. But it's a memorable incident, and actually more so because very often after you ask difficult questions in press conferences, or you have to challenge, you assess, did you ask the question in the right way? Actually, you even get them, you even reassess how you ask them in pretty innocuous press conferences. And at least I think over the years, I feel actually, the way I did it was absolutely something I would do again.
Well, after that, did you ever manage to shake hands or exchange pleasantries with Sir Alex or Ryan Giggs?
Yeah, I've seen them both in the in the years since then. So, yeah, obviously Ferguson's still going strong. His 80th birthday this week, and the times that you got to experience around Alex Ferguson, whether it was in his managerial career and his press conferences, or in the years ahead when getting the opportunity, where the book launches and things like that, to speak to him, always taking to mind that actually he is one of the managerial greats of all time, and he will be revered for many, many centuries to come. So to actually be hearing him in his own words is something pretty incredible, pretty special.
Rob, you've been very critical of the Qatar hosting the World Cup due to the human rights violation. Do you feel that the World Cup should happen in Qatar?
Well, it's an area that we've reported on, and also one that we've tried to listen on as well. Qatar hasn't done enough to try to open up in terms of how it's talking to the world in particular. So let's take the player protest that really stepped up last March during World Cup qualifiers from the likes of Norway. And we basically don't hear much from Qatar. They don't try to even talk at that time to explain. Well, let's talk through what are the changes that have been made to the labour laws and the working conditions. They leave it unchecked, which almost makes you have the ability to say, well, the balance is tilted in favour of the protests in terms of the concerns. But there are so many questions over this Qatar World Cup. I was there in Zurich in December 2010 when the vote took place, and Russia got the 2018 World Cup, Qatar got the 2022 World Cup. And I think it's important to actually remember the build up to that vote. What were the questions and criticisms of Qatar then? It was over corruption claims. There were already investigations, newspaper-led investigations into the conduct of Qatar, and indeed England's bid as well was scrutinised and faced questions over things like spending on handbags for FIFA Executive Committee members. And the issues around Qatar are largely centred on, did it have a football culture? Well, actually, it has had a league going back many decades, and they did win the Asian Cup in 2019, but that's a matter for now. And back to 2010, questions over the heat as well. How could Qatar host the World Cup in the June-July slot, as it always is, given the fierce summer heat exceeding 40 degrees, the humidity? Qatar was insisting, of course, they'd produce this air-conditioned technology, which meant it could be played in the summer. So those are the big questions. They weren't human rights questions at the time. Why? Well, in part, we weren't actually hearing from the human rights groups, the likes of Amnesty, that I remember. That only emerged after they won the vote. Perhaps it's because Qatar started to build more things and they started to build up the infrastructure. That meant the likes of Amnesty had a means of actually starting to scrutinise the conditions that workers were facing. Obviously, many from South Asia going there to work. And what we've seen is that didn't take place before the vote. Should the media have been more aware? Well, certainly we are now. That's why we do ask those human rights questions more critically of hosts. Even just preparing for this interview, I was actually looking around something around human rights in Australia around the 2023 Women's World Cup. So it's not just some Western biases it's perceived by FIFA against perhaps Middle East countries. It's all around the world that we're asking these questions now. And what's undoubtedly the case is Qatar has, under pressure, improved working conditions and living conditions for the the workers in the country. What they do call the migrant worker population. It can seem a bit of a term that's a bit uncomfortable. They are the workers going into the country to obviously help to significantly build the projects needed for the World Cup. And the rights groups do say that it's now the question is over, one, enforcement. Are companies actually enforcing the new laws? And actually, do they still need to go further in terms of securing better pay and living conditions and worker rights? And then you go beyond Qatar and say, have they faced more scrutiny than other say, Gulf nations who haven't stepped up the pace of labour reforms as Qatar have done, and yet the UAE will have the Club World Cup yet again in February of 2021.
So there you had it. One of the crucial voices in the world of football talking about all the important issues. Well, keep looking at Footcast Social, the weekly program. This is me, Sunil Yashkalra, signing off for NewsX.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.